Charles Perrings, now it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't have the depth of experience of Italy or Venice to be able to make such detailed recommendations. But what I'm going to do is pick two of the stones that Yves threw into the water. And I'm going to explore those from the perspective of an economist. So my aim here is to say, this is the way that we would think about the problem. And there are some implications that come out of that, but there are no very precise or detailed recommendations. I'm going to start by telling you something about the way that economists think about conservation. I'm then going to explore the work that's been done so far to identify the value of conservation in cities like Venice. And I'm going to take as one of my, the two stones, the World Heritage System, the system of World Heritage sites. How should we think about the management of World Heritage sites, not just in Italy, but everywhere in the world? I'm then going to do what economists always do, which is, when I was asked to address this problem, my first instinct was to pull out a piece of paper and say, how would I model this? How would I create a theory that would give me an answer to some of these questions? And I'm going to take you through some of that process. And at the end, what I'm going to do is come back to this issue of the problems posed by the mass of visitors in World Heritage sites, and how do you deal with that? How do you resource the reinvention of Venice? So to begin with, do I have a... Thank you. To begin with, how do economists think about conservation? Your instinct might be to say that conservation is a backward-looking idea, that people who are conservative are looking to the past. People who are seeking to conserve are seeking to preserve the past. And nothing could be further from the truth. Conservation is about the future. In order to ask whether or not you want to hold something in a particular state, you need to ask whether the value of the thing in that state is going to grow faster than its value if converted to some other state. There's a very fundamental idea in economics that's due to a man who unfortunately died before the institution of the Nobel Prize in Economics, otherwise he would certainly have had one, Harold Hotelling, a polymath. He was a geographer, but he was also made fundamental contributions in a number of different fields. And in economics, he is the founding father of this discipline of environmental, resource, ecological economics, all of these things combined. And he gave us this insight. When would you be indifferent between conserving a site in one state and changing it to another state? And the test is simple. If its value is growing to you more when it's in the particular state than if you were to convert it to some other state, keep it in that state. So conservation is a choice about the state of the system and the way that it will evolve into the future. And what we ought to be thinking about in terms of Venice is the multiplicity of states that potentially Venice could exist in. Bonnie, during her talk yesterday, said that the problem is about development choices, development options, and it's absolutely about development options. The one thing that may be impossible is for Venice to remain unchanged from this point forward. That will just happen. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, this is automatically progressing, so I haven't been taking you through these slides. So the central features of the problem that I wish to address are: what are the states that might exist for a city that has its base in tourism, and how might we rethink those states? So the World Heritage Sites Venice is an example of a World Heritage Site, but it is the preeminent example of World Heritage Sites. And these sites all have certain characteristics in common, that they all have value which is supposed to transcend the values to the local citizens. And that's the nature of the challenge that we've been focused on here, is how do you manage a system where the value of that system is greater than the value to the people who are the immediate occupants of that system. Potential beneficiaries of the site include the people, and this is true of all World Heritage Sites, who access that site. But they may also include people who never access the site, who gain from the fact that it provides information that provides them with benefits of one kind or another, and I'll talk a little bit about those benefits later on. Let me use this cartoon to illustrate a central property of World Heritage Sites. They are public goods. Public goods, as every economist knows, are the central problem to address in governance. Public goods have two fundamental characteristics that make them difficult to deal with through markets. One is that they are non-exclusive. You can't stop people from accessing them. And Yves mentioned that this is a central problem with Venice, that the rest of the world wishes to access Venice. How are we going to regulate that access? It's a central characteristic of public goods. They have another characteristic, which in the purest form is that they are non-rival in consumption. And non-rival just means that if I consume it, you can't consume it. You can consume it too without any cost. So for example, the light that is benefiting me here benefits everyone else without cost. But it turns out that, let's just go back to this. It turns out that the public good in World Heritage Sites is very much not non-rival. That anyone who accesses that site precludes somebody else from accessing that site or changes the cost to them. So the element of a public good is that if everyone gains from access to the site, everyone gains from the access to the site, then the value of the site is the sum of the benefits to all of those people across the world. And if all of those people are able to pay up to their maximum willingness, then you can realize the full benefits. And the problem with World Heritage Sites, that we can't in fact realize those full benefits because there are no mechanisms allowing people to pay out to their willingness to pay. So the difference between the level of conservation of sites that you would expect to get if you just left it to the market or left it to the interests of local society, so just leave it to the Venetians, the difference between the level of conservation that you would get if you did that and the level of conservation you would get if you took into account the interests of everyone in the world, that difference is called incremental cost. The incremental cost, therefore, the difference in costs that would be warranted if you took the interests of the whole world into account relative to the costs that would be warranted if you took only the interests of people in Venice into account. And there's a gap there that needs to be funded in some way. Finding ways to fund that gap seems to me to be the critical challenge for financial management of these issues. So how do we do this, nationally and internationally? Currently, at the international level, there are intergovernmental institutions designed to do just this. In the environment field, there's the Global Environment Facility, set up specifically to provide the difference in cost that's warranted by national and international considerations. Unfortunately, at the moment, that deals only with natural environment issues, but I'm going to come back to this because it seems to be an important part of the solution. At governmental level, there's taxation used to regulate tourism everywhere, and it is going to be should be an important part of the solution in Venice. At the non-governmental level, there are bodies like the body that Bonnie had responsibility for many years. So the World Monuments Fund is a non-governmental organization designed to generate the resources needed to fund incremental cost. But it does so through tapping the deep pockets of private citizens, concerned citizens in the wealthier parts of the world. It will remain an important part of the solution, but it cannot be the only solution. So because I'm going to come back to this right at the end, say a little bit more about the Global Environment Facility. This was set up in the early 1990s specifically to cover the difference in costs in provision of goods that had some global benefit. And it's gone through a couple of restructurings. Right now, it services a number of international agreements. Preeminently, these are the two of the framework conventions that were agreed at the Rio Conference back in 1992, the one on biodiversity and the one on climate change. Subsequently to that, a number of others have been added. There's a third framework convention on desertification, and there are a couple of conventions dealing with pollution. Most recently, you had added in 2013 the Minamata Convention dealing with mercury. It does not support the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. And one of my conclusions is, at the international level, this is one of the things that we should be trying to change. It would naturally fall within the purview of this system for it to do so. So, why is it interesting? Well, it's interesting because it generates somewhat more resources than are available through non-governmental mechanisms. These are not huge. And if you look at the latest replenishment, it's less than $4.5 billion. Relative to the amount that should be spent on these issues globally, that's a drop in the bucket. It's less than the cost of the MOSA system itself. But nevertheless, this is an area where we should be putting more resources internationally into supporting national efforts that generate global benefits. And one of the recommendations I'll have at the close will deal with this issue. So let's think about the Venice Lagoon. Many different moving parts to conservation. We've heard about a lot of these already, from the MOSA system through mechanisms for dealing with the crumbling buildings within the city. And how's that funded? Well, it's funded mostly through government support, but it's also funded through tourism taxes. And that's going to be one of the instruments that I will look at. Tourism taxes are, in fact, a very, very common mechanism for funding World Heritage sites around the world. If we look at the tourism taxes in Italy at the moment, these are very low. They're currently in Venice, $1 a night for each star of the hotel that you're staying in, unless you're in a ship. Or unless you're in an Airbnb, in which case you don't pay anything. And the maximum that you could pay is $5. Where does that come from? Well, it turns out that there have been studies of tourist willingness to pay, and I report the most extensive of these studies, which is now 10 years old plus. But it was a study of visitors to Venice that asked them specifically about their willingness to pay for conservation actions within the city. And the results came up in that neighborhood, $4 to $5. And when the tourism tax was first introduced, it was €4.50. Now up to €5. There's variation between people's willingness to pay, and I'll just show you from that same study what the variation was. The highest willingness to pay came from American tourists, and then, of course, Italians, very close behind that. The lowest came from the French. Everyone else was somewhere in between. And the average was around €4.50, and €4.50 turns out to have been the initial tourist tax. And that's been adjusted very, very slightly since. I'm going to argue that's too low. And I'm going to argue it's too low because we're ignoring within that a whole lot of things. The things that are not captured by those kind of studies include the benefits to everyone else in the world who's not necessarily going to be accessing Venice other than virtually. And it is a very substantial proportion of the world that gains from the knowledge of the existence of this, the experience of Venice, its value as an experimental site for dealing with climate change, for example. You don't have to be in Venice to gain from the knowledge that is acquired in that way. In the same way that you don't have to ever have been to the Netherlands to benefit from the experience that comes from managing hydrologically a system that's as challenging as that. The other thing you don't capture in those kind of studies is anything relating to the external effects of tourism. And this is another of the stones that I'm going to pick up from Yves' talk. Tourists do have both a benefit and a cost. We'll revert to that in a minute. The benefits are obvious. They're privately gained. The costs are publicly distributed, and they're not necessarily taken into account by tourists, but we don't have a way currently of estimating what those costs are. We should estimate them, and then we should find a way of internalizing them, of making sure that the people who impose those costs carry them. Lots of ways of finding the value of external effects. These are just some of them that come from the field in which I work. Many of those can only capture the effects that are experienced on the ground. Others can capture the non-market value of ecosystem services that are much more widely distributed. And one of the things we're going to need to do in a much better way is to identify what the costs and benefits of different trajectories for Venice are in the future. So ignore the algebra and everything that you see in what follows. Think about this as my shorthand that tells me what I want to talk to you about. Unless you're comfortable with it, then don't ignore it. So what I'm going to do is say, if we think about the problem as a public good problem, what does it tell us about the options for solving that problem? And I'm going to start with a really simplified world. There's a world in which there are m different people, and for now I'm going to assume that they all have exactly the same characteristics. Everyone prefers the same things. They have the same endowments. There's no differences in wealth. And all we're going to do is talk about numbers. So we have m different people, and we can therefore represent their well-being as some sort of function of the well-being of each of the the m different people in society. For private individuals, each one is trying to do their best by some criterion. They're trying to maximize something that we call utility. And they're going to do so by choosing a whole bundle of goods and services or by accessing a World Heritage Site. So the issue here is, how do we think about the trade-offs between those two things? Accessing the World Heritage Site and the bundle of other things that they could be spending their money on. And if you ask what they would optimally do if they were to make a choice that seeks to balance those things, not surprisingly, What they would do is they would increase expenditure on accessing the site up to the point at which just balances the benefits they get from buying everything else, from consuming all other goods and services. So there's a trade-off between those two things. If you increase the cost of one, you persuade them to take a little bit more of the other. And that's going to be part of the solution here. Now, leave people to their own devices. When they make that balance between the benefits to them of access and the costs of the opportunity cost in terms of what they could have if they spent their money on everything else, they will make a choice that critically leaves out of account the effect that their decisions have on the rest of the world. In this case, just in terms of the two stories here, if you look at those the equations on that slide, one of them has the term M in it, the other doesn't. And M, remember, the number of people in society. So what the private individual will do is to neglect the effect on everyone else in society. And that's the problem that we need to address. Each tourist coming into Venice has an impact on every other tourist coming into Venice, and also has an impact on Venetians, and we need to make sure that that's covered in some way, that's respected in some way. The social problem, on the other hand, is to do the best we can for all of the M members in that society. And if we solve the social problem, we're going to come up, it turns out, with a really different solution. So I'm canvassing two different possible ways of addressing this problem from society's point of view. One is to think about that tourism tax. The other is to think about the transfers that a body like the Global Environment Facility makes to cover the incremental cost of conservation locally. Remember that that's the difference in the costs that would be warranted if you took into account global benefits and the costs that are warranted if you take into account only local benefits. So the problem for society, choose those instruments so as to maximize well-being for everyone. Choose either taxes or transfers. Currently, of course, the transfers are not an option. These are voluntary transfers from bodies like the World Monuments Fund. But we could think about circumstances in which they might become an option. So from the point of view of government, what they're seeking to do, or the point of view of a decision maker operating at the level of that M members of the community, they're going to try and maximize the well-being of everyone in some way or another, subject to their capacity to intervene in the system, how they can change the set of outcomes by choosing either taxes or transfers. For the individual, this changes their problem because they now have to face the fact that coming into Venice will cost a bit more. They're going to carry a tax. And that reduces what they can get from their expenditures on accessing a World Heritage Site. On the plus side, you get more conservation of the assets that are going to matter into the future. You generate resources that will deal with some of the problems that we've been hearing about in the last couple of days. So yes, there's a downside. You discourage some tourists from coming. Every tourist who does come makes a contribution, and then that contribution generates the resources that would be needed to deal with the external effects that they impose. And so if we think about one more little cartoon, what this cartoon describes is on the horizontal axis is the level of access. On the vertical axis is costs and benefits. The downward sloping curve just describes the private benefits that people have from access, net of any costs. And if you leave it to them, they will access at the point that's indicated on that cartoon by AP. This is the privately optimal level of access. If they impose a cost on the rest of society, then the upward sloping curve indicates what that might be. The optimal level of access from the point of view of society is going to be less than AP. In fact, it will be at the point where marginal net private benefit is equal to marginal external cost. And the way to get there is to impose a tax on private access that could get you to the point where you're actually at this socially optimal level of access. Dealing with Yves' problem, it's not going to be possible for the whole of the rest of the world, and certainly not for the whole of China, to visit Venice. You can regulate the number of people who come, and you can regulate it using incentives, using market instruments of this kind. So if you're going to set taxes formally, well, this slide has a bit of jargon on it, and you can read the jargon. In plain English, what you're doing is trying to balance the benefits and costs. You're going to set the tax to balance the benefits and costs of access more evenly. And that's what's yet to be done in Venice. But it is a relatively straightforward problem to resolve. I understand the political difficulties of negotiating tourist taxes that extend to those who are not currently taxed, who don't work through starred hotels, but there are easy ways of doing this. It's not an intractable problem. So the last thing I want to do is to say, well, just suppose that the size of the community is not M, but N, and not everyone visits the site. That there are a group of people in the world who don't visit the site, but who nevertheless gain from the knowledge that comes out of that site. So the problem begins to look a little bit different, and here the implications of this are really quite straightforward. If there are a lot of people who are outside the site who yet benefit from that site, true of all World Heritage sites, by the way, then a tax can't do the job for you. A tax on access is not going to solve the problem. You need some other mechanism, and that's what the transfer system might do. So I'm going to close here by giving you some thoughts on what might be implications, both for the things that I do for science, and the things for the implications for the problems that Yves was talking about, the governance issues. So go back to this last slide. What are the implications for science? Well, one is, most important, we need to know what the long-term benefits are to alternative strategies going into the future. There are a whole series of different conservation options. What do all of those conservation options imply for the value of the set of assets in this World Heritage Site now and going forward? It's that looking forward that matters. It's not what is the current value, full stop. It's what the value is and how that will change into the future. We don't currently have those estimates. We don't currently have good estimates of the external costs of current strategies, but we can get better estimates. And it's a challenge for science. It's a challenge for science everywhere, but particularly it's a challenge for science within the city of Venice. The second set of implications deal with policy, both at the national and at the international level. And this is the simplest of all possible implications. So think of this as the lowest hanging fruit that there is in this problem. Set tourism taxes to cover the marginal external costs of access. True, you have to figure out what those marginal costs of access are, the external costs of access. But once you've got that, set tourism taxes to deal with that. And that means that you need to have taxes that are specific to particular regions. You need to have taxes that are not tied to particular types of accommodation. You need to have taxes that can extend to all visitors, whether they're on ship, whether they come via land, via sea, via air. You need to have taxes that deal with the costs of access from different types of people and make sure that they vary to reflect the external costs of the actions of those different types of people. Again, it's not a hard problem, at least in terms of establishing what the optimal tax should look like. It may be a hard problem in negotiating amongst the 21 bodies that have responsibility for the area, but it's not a hard option in terms of the science. The last set of implications is this. I guess you can think about these as longer-term implications, not quite heading towards eternity, but they're not ones that are going to be possible to implement in the next year or two because they involve changing the way that the international community does its business. But one, get the UNESCO World Heritage Convention listed by the Global Environment Facility. Right now, that facility deals only with biophysical problems. And nothing is ever easy at the international scale, negotiating changes in the remit of intergovernmental bodies such as the Global Environment Facility, but it's doable. Pierre was instrumental in negotiating the international agreement on climate change that generated the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's an international body. It took some years to negotiate. I was involved in the preparation of the equivalent body for biodiversity. It took us 5 years to negotiate. Originally, it was proposed by Jacques Chirac in 2005, and the final conference that approved the establishment of that body was in 2012. It takes time, but it's not impossible. And this would be one thing that would be really valuable to do for the World Heritage System. Get it supported through the GEF. Secondly, get the support to the GEF to levels that make it competent to deal with these incremental costs. At the moment, this is a drop in the bucket. 4.5 billion is not nearly enough to deal with the incremental costs of local conservation actions that generate global benefits. But it is our central challenge for the future, to start creating these governance mechanisms that operate at the global scale effectively. And the GF turns out to be one of the few options we have for dealing with this. So I'm going to put that on the agenda as something for the Italian government to consider in its negotiations with the rest of the international community. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Charles. While we were speaking, I was thinking of one of the most crucial issues here in Venice and its lagoon, which concerns the preservation of the morphology of the lagoon, which is one of the source of value. This is a unique site, not only from the point of view of art, architecture, culture, but also from the point of view of the environment. And unfortunately, I must say that the approach you have indicated to consider these incremental costs and, or if you want also, the non-market value of preserving this important part of Venice and its lagoon has not been followed, except some research. You mentioned one research on calculation of willingness to pay, but mainly the way the interventions also of the government in this area has not absolutely considered the idea that there are costs, but there may be non-market benefits. And the result is that at the moment, the situation of the morphology of the lagoon is completely abandoned. Nobody cares anymore. There is no money. There is a phantomatical plan, morphological plan, which has not been approved, not been adopted, silence. And so it's very important what you have. The other point you mentioned is a way to use tax on tourists, not only to discourage, to control, to regulate, but as a source of revenue to support the maintenance of the environmental assets of the lagoon, which is another thing that I'm sure that if you ask tourists, would you be willing to pay something to preserve? I remember once when I went to visit the coral reef in Australia. You pay $1 just to take in the boat to visit the islands and the barrier, just one. And everybody was willing to pay because it was known. So this is a point that should be included in the discussion on organizing a strategy. So thank you very much. Another.